This is The Fall Line. I listened to the first season of Celisia Stanton's podcast, Truer Crime, years ago. There'd been a lot of buzz amongst our colleagues who were making shows that are now generally classified into what people think of as ethical, nuanced true crime. I was told that Celisia was offering deep dives into cases that people might think that they had a handle on. Everything from possible wrongful convictions to large-scale historical tragedies like the Tulsa Race Massacre, and presenting a perspective that wasn't just fresh, it was multi-lensed. Celisia, a 20-something from Minneapolis with a background in debate and photography, had independently done what many large companies have struggled to do: tell complex stories on several levels, without losing the narrative thread that kept her listeners interested. And her audience was learning too. She pulled together historical context that had fallen by the wayside and applied a contemporary perspective that proved that the simple, modern take on true crime was anything but. Simple? Definitely not. And modern? Well, a lot of the issues that existed in our culture half a century ago, they're still at work today. So, truer crime, it's a clever play on words, sure, but it also encapsulates Celisia's mission. The show's description begins with a question. Quote, "Do you ever listen to a true crime podcast and think, that's not quite right?" Same. Crime stories are getting hard to ignore and even harder to forget. But the thing is, they're stories. And getting a story right is all about how you tell it. Truer crime talks about real people, murdered, missing, misled, with more nuance, more context, and more questions. Celisia has been working to get it right since she started. And now, with the official relaunch of her show this January, she's bringing her storytelling to a much larger audience. Celisia often tells the story of how she herself became the victim of financial crime as part of the impetus for the birth of truer crime. But, she says, that's not the whole story. It was a combination of things that converged in 2020 and 2021, during the height of the pandemic, that led her to want to approach longer-form storytelling and to share it with an audience. We sat down to discuss her new season this December, in anticipation of the release of the first 2 episodes. By the time you hear this interview, the trailer for the new season of Truer Crime will have dropped, and on January 20th, 2025, you can listen to the first 2, one covering the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and the other, the murder of Laurah McCluskey, both available through Tenderfoot TV, wherever you get your podcasts. So, Celisia, I know your background story, but I think our listeners would be interested to hear a little about how you got involved in true crime podcasting, because you experienced a nonviolent crime that totally changed the course of your life. How did that influence the eventual creation of Truer Crime, and how did your personal experiences shape the podcast direction?
Yeah, so for me, really, truer crime was like the merging of a lot of different threads, all kind of at one time. I did debate in high school. I'd coached debate for many years. And that kind of, I've always been somebody who just like loves thinking critically, having intellectual discussions, researching, all of that. And, that was something that that was like a side of me that exists all the time, but like really came out in debate and when I was with debate people. And I had this, and I still have this photography business. And in 2020, obviously there wasn't a lot of that going on. It was, pandemic and there wasn't any events. And so for me being from Minneapolis, when George Floyd was murdered, that was like a huge, obviously that's something that impacted the country and the globe with the subsequent uprising. But being right here in Minneapolis, that was something that I was very engaged with and was really significant to my development at the time. And I was posting, having my photography business, I had this social media account, for those businesses or for that business, and kind of had at different points wanted to share things about racial and social justice, but then felt like I had always gotten this messaging about those things needing to be really separate. But when George Floyd was killed and I was really kind of swept up in my community's reaction to that, I decided to start posting just some of the things I was thinking, going live, doing Instagram, racial justice, social justice education, a lot of different swipe graphics, just kind of based in my own lived experience and just the things that I had learned and known through just my personality and the conversations I was having with my friends and all of that. And those posts really were resonating with people. So I had a number of swipe graphics start to go viral. And I grew this platform on Instagram just kind of out of nowhere. And so like I went overnight from being like this wedding photography account to being this racial justice education account. And that was really, in some ways, it was very invigorating because this felt like the truest version of myself to be like talking about these issues that I cared so deeply about. But also, it was tough because it felt very transactional. It felt like a lot of the people who are following me, engaging with me, were doing so maybe because they felt they had to, or because it was just like a moment in time where it was like good to be, learning things about racial justice. And so it felt like the larger aspects of the person that I am kind of didn't matter, right? So I knew that I wanted to continue to do work in that field or area, but I just didn't know what that was going to look like longer term, because I just knew that like it was never going to be the influencer kind of person. I also just feel like social media is obviously not built for nuanced conversations. And that's what I was all about, is I wanted to get into the details and really see the gray area, and like social media is all about the black and white. So that was kind of colliding with what felt unrelated at the time. I was working with this financial advisor. Turned out he was actually defrauding all of his investor clients. So that was something I found out in December of 2020. And so for me, having to kind of navigate that criminal legal process after being defrauded, having my whole life savings stolen, I just found myself in a very different place than I had been even the year before. And I was binging a ton of true crime, specifically podcasts, and just basically spending every day after that crime, just like after I had found out I was defrauded, just listening to episode after episode after episode. And I would just be constantly pausing it and talking to my husband and kind of just being like, it really bothers me that they're not talking about how race plays into this, or gender, sexuality, or, what the root causes are of crime, any of these things that I felt like I was navigating and thinking about and experiencing that I just didn't feel like was being talked about, represented in a lot of the true crime media I was consuming. At the same time, I felt like obviously there was something about this genre that really stuck with me. If I could listen to so many episodes back to back to back, like there was something about the way that folks were telling these stories that stood out to me. And so basically I just kind of complained about these issues I was having to my husband enough that he was like, why don't you try making your own show? And that was kind of the impetus for me making True Crime, was just the converging of my debate background with this social and racial justice education, getting defrauded, and that all sort of just happening at once. And that's sort of what led to the creation of True Crime, and then the season 1 that came out in 2021.
I think you already addressed this somewhat based on talking about all the different factors that were affecting your life at the time. But many people, I think, might have stopped at their personal experience and maybe focused just on those as they were beginning that kind of podcast. But that's certainly not what you did. So what made you decide to immediately take a wider approach to your work?
Yeah, I think for me, so much of this moment of deciding to create True Crime, and so much of the moment of being defrauded, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. Being defrauded was. It wasn't immediately causal. It wasn't like, oh, I was defrauded and now I'm going to start a true crime podcast to examine these things with this new perspective I have. It was like everything that had happened to me in my life leading up to that point put me in this position where once I was defrauded and I started navigating the criminal legal process, it all kind of came together the way that it did. For me, the ways that I was thinking about crime were shaped by obviously my experience navigating as a victim, but also my experience as a Black woman, also by my experience with family members who are formerly incarcerated, by my experiences coaching debate and, like delving into the research, by my experiences facing housing insecurity as a kid, by my experiences experiencing violence that was never prosecuted. And so all of those things really kind of came together for me. I just felt like if I was to make this show and I was to just talk about financial crime, that wouldn't be authentic, because my feelings, thoughts, and questions about this felt much bigger and broader than that. And so that's why I just kind of felt natural to tackle a show which looked at all types of crimes and, all the varying experiences that people have. Because I wanted a show that was really about the human experience, not just about, like one type of crime.
And you already mentioned that after you'd had that experience and in this sort of place in 2020 where things were converging for you, that you really dug into true crime podcast. But prior to that, had you followed true crime media much? I mean, I know we are all exposed to that, whether or not we want to be, just being part of this culture. But was it something that you'd paid much attention to outside of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you said, like I always consume true crime to an extent. I think it's just like, it's a super popular genre too, right? So I definitely like would go and consume it on purpose. And also like fictional versions too. Like I really liked Criminal Minds and CSI and that kind of thing. It just wasn't necessarily in the obsessive way that I did after I was defrauded. What also feels important to clarify is that it wasn't that I was defrauded and then I started consuming true crime because of that. It was more like I got defrauded and then I felt like super depressed. I had nothing to do. You know, it's winter 2020. It's Minnesota. It's freezing cold. And I like sat around literally doing puzzles of cats all day. Like that's what I was doing, like morning till night. And I have ADHD. I'm terrible at just like being mindful. So I couldn't just sit there and do the cat puzzle. Like that wasn't going to fly for me. I had to be listening to something. So I thought, okay, cool. Like I'll just listen to this. And then I was like, so I guess intrigued and entertained, whatever you want to call it, by it. I just kept consuming it. And then because of all those converging experiences that we've been talking about, it like shaped what I was receiving. It was literally just like, I'm just going to consume this because I'm depressed. I have nothing else to do with my day and nothing else I want to do with my day. And so I'm going to just listen. And then like the rest of it was just like, I like having intellectual banter with my husband. We met in debate. It's like totally typical for me to just kind of bounce ideas off of him. And so that kind of, it all just happened really just serendipitously, like back to back until I ended up with the concept for the show.
Just knowing you, I know that you don't tend to think of things in a very surface way. So I'm interested to see what you have to say about this. Mainstream true crime media, and really all true crime media, it all has a huge role in shaping public perception, not just of crime, but also the justice system, which is the part I think about a lot. And as you began to have this idea seed and germinate, go from you just listening to processing to thinking about making your own project, what were some of the big issues that you saw and that you wanted to handle differently in your work, or just even approach in a way that had a different shape?
Definitely, I agree. Like public perception is totally shaped by something like true crime media. And I feel like there was so many things that was sticking out to me, but like overall, one of the biggest things is just how much I felt like I really hated that the takeaway of so much true crime media was for us to be more afraid of one another. You have lots of shows where it's like, anyone could be out to get you. Like that's the moral to take away, right? You can't trust your husband or your neighbor or whoever. You never truly know anybody, right? And I think for me, after I was defrauded, I had a lot of like irrational fears, like things I can code that way now. Like I worried, because after I was defrauded and he was being like, the FBI's investigation had concluded, they were going to like pursue charges against him. It took a while before he was actually arrested. Like he actually didn't go into jail or anything like that until he was sentenced. And then he had a certain number of weeks and then they brought him into prison. He got to turn himself in at that point. So there was, a period of probably like 8 months or something like that. It was actually kind of fast, but a period of like 8 months where he just kind of was out. He knew that this case was going to be prosecuted and he did ultimately plead guilty, but like he knew that was coming for him. And I just was like, so much of the decisions that he made throughout this process was irrational, right? Like he was an actual financial advisor. He was a fiduciary, meaning he had like this responsibility to like make the best choices for his clients, right? He had the proper education and everything. He had clients who were willing to work with him. So like he could have done this on the up and up and he chose not to, right? So that way of thinking did not match up to like how I think or how anyone I know or associate with myself thinks about things. I remember like talking to my husband, him saying like, when I had a lot of fear about like, oh my gosh, I think this guy may have like stolen my money at the time that my husband and I were still dating. So this is just my money I had invested with him. And he was like, oh no, like this man doesn't want to go to jail. Like he knows better than that. Right. And that's not what happened. And so I felt like anybody who could think that irrationally, who knows what else they could do, right? At the time, I remember there was a show too that was like specifically about people who committed white collar crime and then like turned violent. Like they started off with white collar crime and then they moved into violent crime. And so like I had a lot of fears of like, okay, like what if he like shows up to my house because I'm like participating with the prosecution, or like, you know, he has all my personal information. He has my address, he has my social security number, like literally everything that you would normally entrust, a financial advisor with. He has that. What if he like wanted to like attack me for some reason? And I really didn't like how so much of the true crime media that I was consuming was reinforcing those anxieties. And that's something I could just like recognize, is I was feeling like what I wanted was to feel more safe, right? And I think that really led me to question, what does it actually mean to be victim-centered? And that's something I just had to think a lot more deeply about, like, what does that mean to me? And for me, being victim-centered meant trying to create a world where this sort of thing doesn't happen again, where we try to create safeguards so that it doesn't happen again, which isn't the same thing as saying nice things about a victim. It's also not necessarily the same thing as doing whatever a victim or a victim's family might want. And if victim-centered is creating a world where these sorts of things don't happen again, what does that look like? I think about this quote from an activist who I really love named Mariam Kaba. She said in a podcast I listened to once that, we can't create policy from pain, right? That is ultimately reactionary, right? That we can feel our pain and that our emotions are valid, and that, if we're experiencing a crime, right? Like whatever we want as a result of that, that's all valid, but that doesn't mean that we create rules based on that pain. And I think the root of that statement is an understanding that things are nuanced, that it's not black and white, that you can't just apply broad statements to, huge groups of people. And so I think that that's what always felt most important to me in creating truer crime. It's like, yes, I talk about race, I talk about gender and sexuality and systemic issues, but nuance is really my guiding principle. It's like, how can I tell a story that is compelling and interesting and feels like the true crime that a lot of people know and love, but it's nuanced and empathetic and goes deeper than what maybe a lot of folks are used to.
I think that speaks to something I wanted to ask you about, which is that on your show, you cover a mix of cases, but you often cover a comparatively well-known case and offer what I'd call a serious re-examination of the entire thing. And I'd love for you to talk about your interest in approaching what people think they know and how that fits into your concept of what truer crime is. And you have done that with individual cases like the disappearance of Alicia Rudd, and much more expansive topics like the Jonestown Massacre and the Tulsa Race Massacre. And one thing that you have consistently focused on, especially in episodes like your coverage of Sam Mendez and Mindy Dodd, are our cultural concepts of like innocence and guilt and how that plays out in the justice system, especially in regards to incarceration and punishment and how we view punishment as a society. Can you talk a little bit about your focus in each of those episodes and why you felt it was essential to highlight their stories in a new way?
Yeah. So I think for me, the very first case that I ever wrote, and also the first case of the show, was the episode about Darlie Routier. And so I thought like, okay, if I can try to cover a case that has been covered a lot in true crime media, and I feel like I can approach it differently, then maybe this is a good direction for me to go. Like maybe I should do this show. And so diving into Darlie Routier's case, this was a case I had heard on just other shows. And so I was sort of familiar going into my research. But quickly, I really realized how much was missing, how many things I didn't know from the media I'd consumed already. And really, once it took off there with Darlie Routier, it just like, it felt sort of like it flowed easily for a lot of other cases. So for example, on season 1, I covered Jonestown. And this is a case that's really interesting to me because, a lot of people feel like they're really familiar with it. It's very, popular, not just in true crime media, but folks have this like fascination or interest in cults, especially like right now. I think cults have this like kind of cultural moment, right? And I remember I polled like the true crime Instagram audience and kind of in my own personal Instagram audience of like, how familiar are you with this story? And a lot of folks were like, oh yeah, I totally know. I know all the details. And everyone has heard the line like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? But when you actually dive into it, I realized that a lot of people don't know that Jim Jones used messages of racial and social justice in order to get people to join People's Temple. That, he had ties to the Black Panthers and they were kind of like supportive of the work that he was doing. They did a lot of really cool activism work. There's so much tape we have of Jim Jones talking. And like, if you kind of listen to some of his speeches and sermons and how he spoke to people, it feels resonant to some of the same issues we're talking about today. When it comes to cults, people have this very particular view that's like, and it's pretty similar to financial crimes as well, where people think, well, that could never happen to me because I'm not stupid. I'm not going to make a decision that is going to put me in that position. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with the Jonestown episode was really humanize these folks. And I had reached out to a couple of survivors of the massacre. There's only a couple of people who actually survived. And they've been really traumatized by the like media treatment that they've gotten. They don't really like to talk publicly because of those experiences. And I was lucky enough to at least have email correspondence with a couple of folks and get a little bit of their perspective off the record. Because we always do action items at the end of episodes where I'll like kind of direct people to actions that they can take now that they've heard the episode to like, bring this story into their real life. And so if I am working with somebody who's directly connected, I like to ask like if there's anywhere they wanted to direct support. And I remember he wanted to direct support towards like a Black Lives Matter organization because he felt like that was the whole point. That was why I was a part of People's Temple. I really felt like we were doing something. And I think that that's something that felt like unique to this telling. But then also a lot of folks don't know that like the majority of the people who died in Jonestown were Black women, right? They're not familiar with this legacy. And so that's what I try to do a lot with true crime too, is like, if something is surprising to me, I know that it's probably going to be surprising to other people. So that's kind of how I try to sometimes approach these cases that have been told a lot. In this new season of True Crime that's going to be coming out next week, actually on the episode that's coming out on the 20th, where I'm going to be covering the MLK assassination, another case that, people think they know, right? There's a man who was convicted of killing King, and yet the King family does not feel like the man who was put away was the man who was solely responsible. They feel like there was a much larger conspiracy, which likely involved the government and the FBI to kill King. And so this is a case that I really wanted to cover because I was like, this is Martin Luther King, right? Everyone learns about him in school. Everyone knows, they think they know all these different details about him, but how do we not know that the King family themselves feels like there is a cover up around his assassination? Another case I'm diving into in this new season is Charles Manson, another case that, hugely popular, whether we're talking about, just retellings of what actually happened, or we're talking about like dramatized retellings. This is just a case that people are very fascinated with. And I really wanted to dive into, why did Manson do what he did? A lot of folks aren't aware of the details of the fact that he wanted to start a race war, and that he tried to actually pin these murders on the Black Panthers. So these are cases that I just felt like our focus often was in a different area. And so I wanted to see how could we shift the focus to have a larger conversation, maybe about issues that we still have in society.
All those factors were at play. But even a couple decades later, a few generations removed, those stories are being told in a totally different way that have cut out all those incredibly vital factors from the stories. And it's really interesting to see what mainstream media and true crime media in school and everything else has picked out as the important bits of the stories, which actually have very little to do with, for instance, why people were interested in supporting Jim Jones in the first place, why people believed in his vision. So many other things that are vitally important are getting left out.
There's a historical amnesia that happens, I think, often about how most of my friends' parents were alive at a time or born before, interracial marriage was legal, for example. And I think we just and then but then there's this feeling in society of like, oh, well, when Obama was elected, it's like, well, aren't we post-racial? Even just thinking about how the pandemic has sort of warped our understanding and perception of time and experiences. I think that, it creates a landscape where all of us, have something to take away from hearing a new telling of a case or of a story from a perspective that maybe you don't hear in media as much. I know you also mentioned cases of Mindy Dodd and Sam Mendes. And for Mindy's case, that was a really interesting one for me because I actually talk about in the episode that started the episode how I came across it, which is that I'd come across a tweet talking about an article, which I checked out, about the television show Snapped. And it was like, I'd seen probably some episodes of Snapped before, but it's like Snapped is this show that folks are super obsessed with. It's still coming out now, hundreds and hundreds of episodes, and it talks about people like Mindy who, went crazy essentially and killed her husband. And for me, what was interesting about this article was that Mindy was one of several women who felt like there was more to their story than that there was details that you don't get to hear when you put it in this sort of like formulaic snap telling. And at the end of, and actually, when you talk about Mindy's case and you're like, okay, you have this woman who goes crazy and she kills her husband and then she gets locked up for it. It leaves out the fact that her husband was actually her stepfather first, and that he had abused her for years, that she had gotten pregnant multiple times as a teenager by her stepfather, who then left her mother to start a life with her. And when you leave out those details, obviously we're missing a lot. This is also Mindy, still claims her innocence to this day. She says that, she wasn't a part of this plot to kill her husband. And what had stood out to me when I had read this article and I first heard Mindy's story was this end paragraph in the article. And it says, I asked Mindy what a television docudrama on her life would include if she was in charge of it. And she said it would start when she was a child, lingering in those early years so the audience could understand what it was like in that house, being abused by a man she couldn't escape, and the horror and the resignation she felt when she realized she would never be free of him. It would have asked critical questions about her treatment by the criminal justice system, showing how she was interrogated by police without counsel and how lost she was at trial. It would have shown how she still cried at night and asked God's forgiveness. Wasn't that a story worth telling? And that last line really stood out to me because I was like, yes, I thought that was a story worth telling. So when I reached out to Mindy and she was game to talk with me about her perspective, I just kind of wanted to take it from there. It was like this article could provide this sort of base of inspiration for what would her story look like if it was more nuanced. And then in the case of Sam Mendes, that was also an interesting case for me because I feel like, for a lot of people, for most of us, prison is it's just a black hole, right? If you consume a lot of true crime, that's where the story ends. And I was like, what would it look like if we started the story there? What would it look like to examine a case where the story began in prison and ended in prison? And so in the case of Sam, that's literally what I'm doing at the beginning of the episode, is really trying to put the listener in the perspective of somebody who is in solitary confinement, because that's where Sam has spent much of his life. He was convicted as a teenager for a murder that, he didn't, the state doesn't even necessarily believe that he directly committed. He was actually caught up in this Colorado's felony murder law, which means that if you take part in a felony, let's say it's a robbery, and somebody dies in the course of that felony, you can be charged with capital murder, first-degree murder. And that's what happened in his case. They didn't necessarily even have proof that he had killed this woman, but they were like, maybe he was there at a robbery that happened at her house and then she was killed by somebody else. So he was convicted of this crime as a teenager, went to prison, and then very quickly was swept up into a cycle of being put into solitary confinement over and over and over and over again for very long periods of time. And that obviously, for most people, would do something to your mind, to your ability to understand reality. And so this episode just kind of really examines what that's been like for him, what that's been like for the folks who he left on the outside, right? He has a son who basically grew up without him. And also just kind of having to examine questions of why do we just forget people who are in prison? Are they not humans too? What is it? How do we feel when we actually know what's happening in prison? And even if we're okay, now we listen to the episode, we're aware of it, having to deal with the complicated reality of the fact that the damage is done. So even if he is removed from solitary confinement, even if he receives a mental health support, even if he's let out of prison, the lingering effects of what happened to him in prison are never going away. And so those are just all things I kind of wanted to examine with that case as well.
One thing I want to circle back to, I think that your background as someone trained in debate and then someone who trained people in debate obviously is going to give you incredibly strong research skills. So I'd really love to hear about how you began working on true crime during what was really the height of the pandemic and how that affected your show.
So I actually started writing it like December of 2020, so like 4 years ago. So it was kind of like as the world moving into January, and then the show came out in the spring. It was actually like as the world was starting to open up. I think like the vaccines came out in like the spring of 21. So it probably would have been different had I been writing it even just 6 months earlier. But for me, honestly, it was mostly helpful because it just gave me a lot of uninterrupted time to really try to develop this show and spend a lot more time with each case before our show comes out. It's like there's not as much pressure of like it has to come out by a certain time because it's never been out before. So for me, it just kind of gave me the time and space that I needed to like really feel like I could delve deeply into a case and really understand it. It was very important to me that I wanted to put out a show where I at least, everyone's going to make mistakes, especially as a small team without a lot of resources. You're not necessarily going to get everything right, but I wanted to try to do my due diligence to try to make sure that things were independently verified and that they were coming from good sources and all of that. And that when I could get them, they would be coming from primary sources or directly from the experiences of the people who went through it. Since this was independent, I didn't have a ton of resources and I didn't have a media background of like, how do you actually go out and reach out to people? And I wanted to be sensitive too. And I found that what was like helpful for me was kind of just leading with my own experiences and kind of what my goal and mission was with the show. And I think that's why I was able to actually connect with somebody, the survivors from Jonestown, and they were willing to speak with me even off the record. And same thing when I would reach out to folks who were incarcerated, was just trying to talk to them like a human being versus like trying to be too like, I don't know, like reportery or anything like that. Because I'm not a reporter and I'm not, I went to college, but I'm not an academic. And I was just like a debate coach and a person who had been defrauded in like a 20-something in Minneapolis. I wasn't super credentialed, and I felt like that was something that people resonated with. And I definitely felt comfortable with the research aspect because of debate. And I just wanted to write in a way that sounded like me. I wanted it to be a show to be approachable and consumable because I wanted truer crime to be seen as any other true crime show. I felt like highlighting its differences too much felt like shortchanging what I was going for, which was to make more nuanced true crime be the standard or like the expectation versus like, oh yeah, this is true crime, but like make it ethical. This is true crime, but make it social justice. This is true crime, but it has the black host. It was like, this is true crime and this is how it should be told. So I don't know that like, going through this during the pandemic, like shaped the show in terms of like how the resources I was able to find, but it definitely kind of like gave me the time and space to really develop what I wanted the show to stand for, if that makes sense.
What kind of stories do you want Truer Crime to tell in the future, both in terms of your personal focus and what you want your audience to re-examine and rethink, but also enjoy, to see in a truer way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really want to keep telling all types of stories because, and I was saying this earlier, but I really want us as a society to reconfigure the way that we're looking at crime broadly, justice. And so whether that's going to be like an iconic case or like an unheard of case or anything else, if I feel like there's a takeaway that can lead listener to engage or think more critically, like maybe it'll lead them to have a conversation with a friend or family member or something like that, then I'm all about that. Because I have that debate background and that's at like kind of the core of who I am, I see value in just thinking and talking about hard things. And mostly because I feel like that's what drives action. And for me, it's like I really do see the value in individual stories. That was something that I feel like I experienced or like I witnessed when George Floyd was murdered. It's not as if like police brutality started with the murder of George Floyd. Certainly not even in my city or like the Twin Cities, right? Like before George Floyd, you have Philando Castile in St. Paul, another, really a case that made national news, and others as well. So it's not like, oh yeah, George Floyd was killed and now all of a sudden it's like, this is the moment where we realize, oh, this is a problem. This has been something that's been going on for a long time. But it's the power of his individual story, of that individual, of the video, right, that goes viral, that drives a movement that ends up being global. And so for me, that's something that just really stood out. And that's something I'm always thinking about with truer crimes. It's like, when we narrow the scope, when we like talk about big issues, but we do it through the vehicle of an individual experience that somebody can connect to, that's going to drive people to actually go out and do something, whether that be something as simple as having that conversation or something like a donation or something bigger like a movement, like what we saw in 2020. And so any story that I feel like has the power to do that is a story that I want to cover on True Crime.
Now that you're working with Tenderfoot, are there ways that you'd like to expand the show that maybe you hadn't imagined as an independent podcaster?
Obviously, I would definitely love to do more episodes of True Crime, like hopefully season 2 is the beginning and we can continue telling these stories. But I also really would love to do longer form series on individual cases, right? Like limited series where we're covering one case over, 8, 10, 12 episodes. Obviously, like as somebody who really is about those nuances, I always feel like there's so much that we're leaving out of every case that we're writing for True Crime. And so I would love to kind of like delve into that for like a singular story. And that's something we're kind of looking into actually right now. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of share with the world eventually. But yeah, I really, like I said, I really want True Crime to be a part of this like broader genre shift. And so I think that's going to be something that continues to evolve for me as I can engage with people and they can like listen to the episodes and I can kind of like see how people are reacting to them and what questions it's bringing up and what types of stories are resonating for folks. But for me, like, do really just see this as the beginning.
One of my favorite things, I think, about how you think is how deeply you listen to your audience and what they're responding to.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting too, just kind of having like a social media presence, like especially on TikTok, because that's really what, after the first season came out, that's really how we were able to kind of like try to promote it or get it in front of people. And TikTok comments are a scary place. Like I feel like it's a lot of comments you need to ignore, a lot of things that aren't going to be helpful. But also there's like, it was really interesting to be able to see like, oh, wow, people really want this. They're really resonating with this idea of like, wanting true crime that goes deeper, of feeling like, and at a time, obviously, this is like a conversation like around ethical true crime, I guess, that's been happening for the last, 4 or 5 years. But I feel like at the time that we were doing a lot of this TikTok stuff in 2020, 2021, it felt kind of newer and fresher. And it was just kind of interesting to be like, oh, wow, people actually want this. They're thinking this too. It's not just me, or a couple other creators who I knew who are already in this space doing that work. So yeah, I definitely see it as a super valuable tool to like connect with what they're thinking. And I feel like it's so hard because with podcasting, it's like you're in your silo and you're like in your closet and you're like, is anybody listening to this? Or is anyone like vibing with this? So that's definitely been helpful.
Yeah, and finding out exactly what stories make them excited in the same way that they make you excited.
Yeah, exactly.
I am so thrilled to listen to the new episodes and to support them and to share them with our audience. Everyone needs to go ahead and subscribe right now so they don't forget. Celisia, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome to chat with you and kind of dive into all of this. And yeah, I hope folks will check out the show.
Be sure to check out Celisia's new season of True Crime. She is a colleague that we're excited to support, and we think her work will resonate with our audience. Again, you can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. The Fall Line will be back with the new season in February, when we'll be covering cold cases of missing and murdered individuals across the country, including the story of a family who has faced 2 missing persons cases more than a decade apart. We'll return to New Mexico, Montana, and Tennessee, and we'll continue to work with our partners in those states who are pursuing justice for cold cases. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. If you were subscribed to our Apple ad-free and early feed, please be aware that there was an issue with the app and it was accidentally hidden, and listeners were unsubscribed. So please keep an eye out for that to reappear soon. All subscription earnings will still be going to the therapy fund just as soon as we can get it back up and running. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, and pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you listen on Apple Podcast, please be sure to check your subscription and make sure you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon. 100% of our Patreon earnings are supporting our family therapy fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1.